They say the Middle Ages were a time of knights, castles, and glory. A world of shining armor, royal banquets, and heroic tales sung by minstrels. But in the shadows, far from the songs and celebrations, another reality existed. A reality carved, not in stone, but in fear. There were devices, strange, merciless creations, designed not merely to kill, but to unmake the human spirit long before death arrived. Engines of suffering, forged in iron and wood, whose purpose was not swift justice, but lingering torment, forgotten by time, hidden in dusty manuscripts, and whispered about in trembling voices by peasants. These machines carried reputations so dark that even their names inspired dread. They were not punishments of law alone, they were symbols of absolute power. Imagine a cold dungeon, damp walls dripping with water, a single torch flickering weakly. In the corner, the outline of one of these devices waits silent, patient, like a predator ready to strike. The very sight of it could make the strongest knight falter, and the bravest soul pray for mercy. Tonight, we descend into the darkest chambers of medieval Europe, a place where silence often echoed louder than screams. And I must warn you, once you learn of these devices, you will never look at the Middle Ages the same way again. To truly understand these devices, you must first step into the world that created them. Medieval Europe was not a land of peace, it was a land ruled by fear. Fear of God's wrath, fear of kings and nobles, fear of the unknown forces people could not explain. Justice was not about fairness, it was about reminding people of their place. And torture was never simply about punishment. It was about control, about power made visible. Imagine yourself standing in a crowded town square. Merchants stop shouting, children grow silent, and every eye turns to the center. There, a device of iron and wood stands gleaming in the firelight, unused, yet terrifying. It doesn't have to be active. Its mere presence is enough. It whispers a message louder than any priest or ruler could. Step out of line, and this could be your fate. For the villagers watching, fear was the strongest chain. And rulers knew that fear did what swords alone could never achieve, kept people obedient, quiet, and controlled. So when we speak of these forgotten devices, remember, they were not just tools of cruelty, they were symbols. Symbols that turned pain into a language every villager understood. And now, let us walk deeper into the stone chambers and shadows. To uncover the devices so horrifying that even the bravest knights trembled at their sight. And here is the most unsettling thought. For many villagers, these devices were never just instruments of punishment. They became part of daily life, silent guardians of order, reminders carved in iron and wood. Even when no one was chained, their shadows lingered. They taught people that obedience was survival, and questioning power was the fastest path to ruin. And so, fear was not only in the chains or the blows, it lingered in the silence of the crowd, in the lowered eyes of neighbors, and in the prayers whispered at night. In the end, fear itself was the sharpest device of an unseen weapon that ruled more powerfully than iron. At first glance, it looked like a throne of power, solid, immovable, almost regal in its presence. But this chair was no seat of honor. It was a throne of torment, crafted not to raise a ruler high, but to break a human being piece by piece. Imagine stepping into a cold stone chamber. The air smells of rust and smoke. And in the center sits a heavy iron chair, its surface covered with hundreds of sharp points, each one waiting like a silent executioner. The victim was forced to sit, sometimes pressed down and tied with iron clamps until they could not move an inch. Every breath, every twitch, every desperate attempt to shift brought the spikes deeper into the skin. It was not meant to kill quickly, it was meant to teach suffering, second by second, hour by hour. Sometimes, hot coals or burning embers were placed beneath the chair. Slowly, patiently, the iron grew hotter until the metal itself seared through flesh. The cruelty of the device was not in speed, but in its patience. The pain lingered, stretched out, forcing both victim and onlookers to endure the long passage of time. Now pause for a moment and imagine you are in the crowd, watching. The victim is not screaming at first, only breathing, trembling. But as the hours pass, their voice grows weaker, their body heavier, until silence hangs over the room. Do you turn away, or do you keep watching, because you fear that looking away might mark you as the next to sit in that chair? And here lies the true horror. Was the punishment the pain itself, carved into flesh? Or was it the quiet obedience it created in every witness, the unspoken command that no law, no priest, no king needed to repeat because the chair itself had already spoken louder than words? And even after the victim was gone, the iron chair remained. It stood in the chamber like a shadow that never faded, cold and waiting for the next body to fill its place. For some, the sight of the empty chair was more terrifying than seeing it in Useby, because it reminded them that at any moment, anyone could be chosen. In this way, the chair was more than a device. It was a silent ruler, commanding obedience without ever moving. The most infamous of them, all the rack. At first glance, it seemed deceptively simple. Just a wooden frame, long and sturdy, with rollers fixed at each end. Yet, within this simplicity lay one of the most feared tortures of the Middle Ages. The victim's wrists were tied at one end, their ankles at the other. Then, with the slow turn of a handle, the rollers pulled tighter and tighter. At first it was just strainer, burning tension in the arms and legs. But with each creak of the wood, the body was stretched beyond the limits nature had intended. Bone by bone, the frame tore its victim apart. Ligaments strained until they snapped. Joints cracked like branches breaking in a storm. Muscles stretched and ripped. The body became something unrecognizable, a grotesque display of power and control. But here's what made it truly terrifying. Most victims did not die immediately. The rack was designed with precision, carefully balancing agony with survival. Many endured hours, sometimes days before death arrived. Some lived, crippled for life, their broken bodies carried through the streets as warnings. Imagine being a villager watching this unfold in the square. You would hear the victims' screams echo through the stone walls, each turn of the rollers sending waves of horror into the crowd. And yet people gathered, not to stop it, but to watch. The rack was theater public fear turned into spectacle. And for those who survived, the torment didn't end with release. Their twisted bodies were constant reminders of the state's reach. Every step they limped, every crooked movement they made whispered the same message: defy the rulers, and you too will face the rack. What would it feel like, I wonder, to carry not just the scars of torn flesh, but the memory that your suffering was turned into a show, that your agony had been applauded, remembered, and then forgotten by those who walked away untouched? The rack was not just a machine of pain, it was a stage upon which power performed its darkest play. And perhaps this was the rack's cruelest legacy, not just the broken bodies, but the silence that followed. The fear of its wooden frame lingered in every town, a reminder that obedience was bought with agony. At first glance, the heretic's fork looked almost harmless, like a simple tool, something that could have been found in any workshop of the Middle Ages. A small rod of iron, light enough to carry in one hand, yet in its simplicity lay its true horror. The device was crafted with precision, a short metal bar, tipped with two sharp prongs at each end. One end pressed upward beneath the chin, digging ever so slightly into the skin. The other end pressed downward, just above the chest or the throat. It was then strapped around the victim's neck, locked into place with leather bindings. Now imagine being forced into that position. Your head tilted unnaturally high, unable to bow, unable to speak, unable even to let your body rest. Every single movement, every twitch, every swallow, every attempt to breathe more deeply caused the prongs to bite further into the flesh. It was not the kind of pain that killed instantly. Instead, it was a slow, gnawing reminder that you no longer had control over your own body. Even the smallest mistake, a shift of muscle or a gasp of air, punished you immediately. But the cruelty went beyond the physical. The fork made speech impossible. Words, those last weapons of the condemned, were taken away. A victim could not call for mercy, could not pray aloud, could not curse their captors. They were trapped in perfect silence, forced to live within their own fear. Now ask yourself, how long could you endure such silence? Hours? Days? Some accounts say victims wore the fork for entire nights, unable to sleep because the moment their head drooped, the metal reminded them with a stab of pain. The true genius of the heretic's fork was psychological. It did not spill blood in the streets, nor draw a cheering crowd like the rack or the wheel. Instead, it worked in secret chambers, in candlelit halls where interrogators leaned close, whispering questions the victim could never answer. And perhaps that was its real purpose, not to destroy the body outright, but to strip away dignity, to remind the accused that even silence could be weaponized against them. When we think of medieval torture, we often imagine fire, chains, and screams. But the heretic's fork reminds us that, sometimes, the cruelest torment came not from sound, but from the absence of it. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was not merely a device. It was theater, a performance staged for entire towns, where cruelty itself became a spectacle. Picture it. In the center of a square stands a massive wooden wheel, taller than a man. The victim is dragged forward, bound, and terrified. Their limbs are tied wide across its frame, stretched in the open, leaving no chance to resist. And then came the blows. One by one, heavy iron bars slammed down upon arms, legs, and ribs. Bones cracked like dry wood. The body did not die quickly, but piece by piece, it was dismantled. Every strike carried not just pain but humiliation, because the crowd was watching. The wheel's cruelty was not in speed, but in delay. Victims lingered, suspended between life and death, their twisted forms reminders of authority's reach. Once broken, the wheel was raised upright, displayed high above the square. so every villager child, elder, and traveler alike would see the fate of defiance. And the torment did not end with the executioner's hand. The aftermath was its own punishment. Victims sometimes lived for hours, others for days, left exposed to scorching sun, icy nights, and the relentless pecking of crows circling overhead. Imagine lying there, helpless, watching the world move on while your own body betrayed you with every shallow breath. The wheel was more than punishment, it was message. Each turn of the wood declared, the law will not only take your life, it will take your dignity, your image, your very memory. For long after the screams faded, the broken figure remained, a gruesome monument to power. Now let me ask you, was this truly justice? Or was it ritualized cruelty, cloaked in the language of law, meant not to correct crime, but to terrify the living into silence? And perhaps the most haunting thought is this: what did it do to the crowd? Did they walk away shaken, or did they grow accustomed to the horror? Because when suffering becomes entertainment, how long before humanity itself begins to break? Some devices were designed to break the body, but others, they were meant to break the soul. The pillory was one such device. At first glance, just a wooden frame set in the middle of the town square, but once locked inside head and hands, trapped it, became a prison of humiliation. The condemned stood there for all to see, unable to move, unable to hide. Passers-by spat, mocked, and hurled rotten food. Children pointed and laughed, their small voices echoing louder than any iron chain. Neighbors whispered behind their hands, and friends, those who once shared bread at the same table, turned away in silence. For a medieval man or woman, honor was everything. Reputation was survival, and the pillory struck at that very heart. Bruises faded, cuts healed, but shame lingered like a shadow that could never be outrun. Think about it. How many souls were destroyed not by iron, but by the weight of humiliation? How many walked away from the pillory still breathing, yet never truly alive again? Not every device was forged from iron or carved from wood. Some were far simpler and far crueler. They were rooms, chambers of stone, designed for a different kind of torment. Picture this: a dungeon buried beneath the earth, where no sound could escape and none could enter. The walls thick, the air damp, the darkness absolute. The victim, stripped not of their body but of their world, was left inside with nothing but their thoughts. No voices, no footsteps, no flicker of a candle. Days blurred into nights, though time itself seemed to vanish. The silence became deafening, so heavy it pressed upon the chest like an invisible weight. In that emptiness, the mind began to turn against itself. Hallucinations appeared in the void, phantom whispers, ghostly shapes moving in the dark. The prisoner did not know if the horrors were real or born of madness. And that was the design. This was not pain that could be measured in wounds or bruises. It was despair sharpened into a weapon. The silence itself became the torturer, cutting deeper than any blade. This was the cruelty of the Middle Ages, proof that to break a person, you did not always need fire, chains, or iron. Sometimes, all it took was nothing at all. So what do we make of these devices? Were they truly just as tools meant to protect order? Or were they the twisted inventions of rulers and priests, desperate to maintain their grip on power? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between, for in medieval Europe, punishment was never simply about crime. It was about spectacle. It was about sending a message that pierced deeper than the flesh. And that is why these devices were not forgotten because they failed, but because they worked. They instilled fear so profound, so unforgettable, that generations later, we still whisper about them, almost afraid to speak their names aloud. Think of the iron chair, the rack, the wheel monuments, not of justice, but of control. Their purpose was not only to break bodies, but to bend souls, to remind every villager, noble, and peasant alike, obedience is survival. And perhaps that was the true genius and the true horror of these creations. They turned cruelty into memory, memory into legend, and legend into power. So I ask you, when you picture the Middle Ages, do you see shining knights and towering castles? Or do you hear the silence of dungeons, the clatter of chains, and the echoes of screams swallowed by stone? If you want more journeys into the darkest corners of history, subscribe, because some stories cannot remain buried. They demand to be told, no matter how much time has tried to erase them.